So we are doing 15 marker from October 2025, paper 2-3. Okay, as we discussed, this question is a bit tricky. So we have to first visualize it and then we'll be able to solve it. So there is a 2D array called number generated, which stores each number generated for each player. Okay, so there are two players. Random whole number values are generated for each of the players. Okay, so random whole number means we have to use two functions here. So we should label it here. It would be a round function and it would be the random function, like this. Then we have to compare the numbers and we have to give points. Okay, so the game works as follows. 100 random whole numbers between 1 to 6 are generated for player 1 and stored in the array. Then 100 random whole numbers between 1 to 6 are generated for player 2 and then stored in the array. So this would be kind of overlapping code for both of these players. Same logic, just different arrays. Then the first number generated for each player is, okay, so we missed one thing here. That is this part. The first dimension stores the player number and the second dimension stores the random whole numbers generated. Okay, now this is very important to differentiate. So first dimension is always the row and second dimension is always the column. So in this question, they're asking you to make a 2D array with two rows and it stores the random numbers of 100 numbers. So we have 100 columns. So let's go ahead and draw this. So like we did previously, this is how the visualization would look like. This would be your 2D array here. We'll call it number generated. So this is the number generated array. So number generated array, which is the 2D array with 100 values in it. Like this. And it has two rows and then it has 100 columns. Then in the second part, they're saying that you are supposed to calculate based on a comparison. So the first number generated for each player, first number generated for the each player is compared and the player with the high number is awarded 2 points. Okay, simply means, so we look at the first number that was generated for player 1 and then for player 2. Since player 1 had a larger number than player 2, what we have to do is now we have to give 2 points to the player that has the high number. So for this we can make an array or we can create just two totals here and we can keep updating the totals over and over again. So in fact, let's just get rid of this whole thing. Let's just have an array with two elements like this. Okay, so we have this array, index 1 and index 2. So this would be our points array or totals array. Okay, so index 1 would hold the points for player 1 points and then index 2 would hold the player 2 points. So since 5 is greater than 2, so we are going to give 2 points to player 1. Okay, then they're saying the comparison repeats for 100 numbers generated. Okay, so we have to do this on and on. So then player number 2 has a larger value, so player 2 will get 2 points. Then player 2 has larger value, player 2 gets 2 more points, so it becomes 4. Now they both have same points. Okay, the question says when they generate the same number, then both are awarded 1 point each. Okay, so when they both have 1 point each, we'll add that into the total. So both of these values are 4. So this would become 1 point would make it 3. 1 point added here would make it 5. Then 2 and 6, again, same logic. So 6 is larger, player 2 has a larger number, so 7. Then we keep on doing this until the very end. Okay. Once the comparison is complete, the player with the higher total number is the winner. Now, if the players have the same number of points, a new random whole number is generated for each player and compared. Okay, so this means, let's say if the total turns out to be 30 and 30 for both. So what we have to do now is we have to generate a random number for player 1 and then for player 2. And then we are going to add this. So with if players have a new whole number is generated for each player and compared. This is repeated until one player has a higher number than the other. So 2 points are added to the player's total number of points. So we have to do the same thing essentially. If there is a tie, so let's say both have 30 points. Let's say I randomly generate two numbers. Again, it becomes 32 and 32, which is again a tie. So I'll generate a new number again and maybe the new number is 4, 3, and maybe 1. So now, since player 1 got the larger number, so we'll say that player 1 is winner and player 2 would be the second position. This is what you have to do in the program. Now we'll start writing the code. So the first requirement is input and validate the names of the two players. Okay, so here we'll go with the assumption that, as you guys suggested, that that names can be empty or same. So we'll write the code for that. Okay, and the question says no declaration is to be done. So we won't do any declaration and we'll start writing the code. So in the first part, we will just ask the user to input the names, and so we'll say repeat until, so until name 1 is not equal to name 2 and name 1 is not equal to empty and name 2 is not equal to empty, right? So until both of the names are not same, until name 1 is not left empty and name 2 is not left empty. Okay, as long as that is the case, so we'll keep on asking the user to input enter name for player 1 and then we input that. So let's call it input into name 1 and then we do the same thing, enter name for player 2 and we say input name 2, and this keeps on happening until all of these conditions become true. So let's say if both of the names are same but they're also empty, so this would not work. So this would be the very first condition. Also, in some of the cases you might notice in the marking scheme that they write two separate loops. Okay, so they'll have one loop separate for the player 1 and one loop separate for player 2. That is completely fine. The idea is, let's say if player 1 got the correct name, let's say they inputted maybe let's call it ABC. Okay, so player 1 names themselves ABC and player 2 leaves their name empty. So since player 1 got the name correct, they should not have to re-input it again, right? So in this case, we're just simplifying the logic. You can do it that way as well. That would be more convenient, but at the same time, you do not lose marks for this. This is an easier way of writing the same thing. Okay, now once this is done, we move to the next part. They're saying now generate 100 random numbers between 1 and 6 inclusive for each player and store them in the number generated array. Okay, so now we have two rows and for each row we have 100 values. That means we have to write a nested for loop. So for row 1 to 2 and for column 1 to 100. Okay, so this is done. Now for each value we have to generate a random number between 1 to 6. Okay, so random number generation, as we discussed before, works like this. So whatever numbers you have a start number, you have the end number. So what we do is that we add the starting number and we multiply the difference of the range with the random function. So random can only generate values between 0 to 0.99. So we multiply it with the difference. Let's say we have 10 to 50 range. So 40 is the difference. It will randomly generate 0, 0.5, 0.1, 0.9, and then we'll simply add the starting value to make it between the range. And then we have to round it to 0 decimal places because the question says that they must be rounded to a whole number. So we have to apply the same logic here, and then we have to store these values. Okay, so we have to use the number generated array. So number generated current row comma current column, okay, would be equal to random times the difference of the range. So the range is 1 and 6, so 6 plus 1 is 5, and we simply add the starting number here. Okay, but this will generate a number in real data type, so we need to round it to the nearest whole number. So I'll just put it inside a comma, and like this the number is generated, and then we'll get this sort of a formation inside our 2D array. So all of the values would be successfully populated. So we have next column and we have next row like this. Okay, so this is done. Then in the next part of the question, they're saying calculate and store the total number of points for each player. Okay, now we have to run the loop again. So now we are creating a totals array which will hold two values. So we need to initialize that array first of all. That is very important. So I'll run a loop for I1 to 2. Or since there's just two values, I can just say points index 1 is set to 0, and I think we called it totals. Yes, totals. So totals index 1 is set to 0 and totals index 2 is set to 0. We don't need to use a loop here because it's just two elements. Okay, now this is done. So both of these would be set to 0 initially. So index 1 and index 2, player 1 and player 2 total scores. Now we have to start the comparison again for both of the values. So we'll run a loop. Now there are a total of 100 columns, and we know that row 1 will contain player 1 scores and row 2 will contain player 2 scores. So we can just use a single loop here. So here we'll write for row 1 to 100, for column 1 to 100. Okay, now here I am going to check the current points. So let's assign them into a variable so we don't have to rewrite the lengthy name over and over again. So let's call it P1 points, or let's call it points 1. So points 1 would be equal to number generated, current row, which is row 1, column, that will be given to by this variable. So it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way till the end. But the row is fixed. So it will be 5, then 2, then 1, then 4, then 2, then 6, then 6, etc. And then similarly for points 2, number generated, 2 comma column. So it will pick the second row and it will go all the way till the end. Okay, now once we have both the points, now we're going to start making the comparisons. Okay, so the question said the rule is if either of the player has larger number of points, then you are to give them 2 points. Okay, so if points 1 is greater than points 2, then what we're going to do is that in the totals index 1 array, I'm going to increment it by points 1. Okay, what does this mean? So initially both points are set to 0, total are set to 0. Since 5 is larger than 2 and 5 is in the points of player 1, so we are going to give 2 points into player 1's overall score. And that is what we're doing here. So we are just
So if it points,
so we are going to add 2 here, not points. Okay. If that is not the case, so else if points 2 is greater than points 1, then in totals index 2, this should be totals, at the second index of our array, will go and will add 2 here. So in this case, let's say 6 is greater than 2. So we are going to give a score of 2 to player number 2. Then in the next case, player 2 has again more points. So we are going to add 2 more points. So the score becomes 4, so on and so forth. Okay. Now they have said if that is not the case, if both of the points are equal, then what are we going to do? So when both of them are equal, we are going to award 1 point to each player. So that is what I'm going to do. I'll just say totals index 1 is equal to totals index 1 plus 1, and totals index 2 is equal to totals index 2 plus 1. We just simply add 1 point to both of them and then we end the loop. So once the loop ends, we would have a fully formed 2D array and a fully formed 1D array with 2 totals, just like this. I'll get rid of this. And then we have to make the final comparison now. Okay, now the question says, the condition is that you have to calculate and store the total number of points. So we have done that. Output the name and the points for each player. Okay, so if there are, if they both get the same points, then you have to regenerate the random numbers. So a new random number is generated for each player and compared, and this is done until one player has a higher number than the other one. Okay, so now we have to make the condition. We'll add the comments at the end. So we'll check if totals index 1 is equal to totals index 2, then, which simply means if both of these values are same. So let's say this is 30 and this is also 30. Since they are the same, now we have to generate random numbers for both of the players. And this has to be done inside a loop. So repeat until, and then we have the end if. Okay, so we are going to repeat until P1 is not equal to P points 1. Okay, let's reuse the same variable so we don't have to use So until points 1 is not equal to points 2. Okay, now what would be points 1? So we have to regenerate the random number again. This is literally what we've done before, so I'm just going to copy this. We have to do this again. We have to generate a random number between 1 to 6 for points for the player 1, and we have to do the same thing for player number 2. And we keep on doing this until the values are different. So let's say points 1 comes out to be 5 and points 2 comes out to be 2. Okay, now once you have done this loop, you have to make a comparison which number is larger. So again, we have to do the same thing. If this is the case, then we will uh, give the same points to player 1, otherwise to player 2. So I can just copy this and I'll check. So if points 1 is greater than points 2, then we are going to simply add 2 points into total 1. Else if points 2 is greater than points 1, then we are going to add 2 points into totals 2. Okay, so again, so we got in points 1 we got here maybe 3, and points 2 here we got 5. Since this number is larger, so I'm going to add 2 points here, so this becomes 32, and now player 2 is the winner. And that's it. It was basically repetition of the previous part. So if you were able to do that correctly, this would also work the same way. Okay, now the last part says output the name and the total number of points for each player in descending order of total number of points. Okay, so you do not have to use the bubble sort here, okay, because there's literally only 2 values. So you can just use if condition here. No need to implement a complicated bubble sort. That would be needed if you have like 5, 10 values. So we'll check if totals index 1 is greater than totals index 2. If that is the case, then that means the player 1 is the winner. So we'll write that. So they're saying output the name and the total points. Okay, so we'll output the name. We'll say the name of player 1 was name 1. Okay, so name 1 is the winner with total points of comma totals index 1. You can do it in separate lines or you can do it in the same line. It's up to you. And then we output name 2 is the runner-up with, or you don't have to write this is first, because in the exam you don't have this much time, is second with total points of comma totals index 2. So if that is not the case, else you will do the same thing but with your flipped values. So you will say otherwise name 2, name 1, and here you'll have totals 2 and totals 1, and then we simply end if. That's it. That is the whole question. Now the only thing left is to add comments, so we'll do that.
Sir, I had a question.
Okay, with this we are done. The question is complete.